The rain hammered against the mountainside like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding against the rocky terrain with violent intensity. Staff Sergeant Maria crouched behind a boulder, her sniper rifle steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The storm had rolled in without warning, turning what should have been a routine extraction mission into a nightmare that would test every skill she had learned in her 12 years as a Navy SEAL. The mission had started 3 days earlier at Camp Leatherneck in Afghanistan. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against NATO forces, was hiding in a remote village nestled in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The plan was simple: insert a small team, locate the target, and extract him for interrogation. Maria was assigned as the team's designated marksman, her reputation for precision shots in adverse conditions making her the obvious choice. Team consisted of 6 members, each hand-picked for their expertise. There was Lieutenant Commander Jackson, a seasoned operator with over 50 missions under his belt. Petty Officer First Class handled communications and electronic warfare. Chief Petty Officer Williams was their explosives expert, capable of turning everyday materials into devastating weapons. Petty Officer Second Class Martinez served as their medic, his steady hands having saved more lives than anyone could count. Finally, there was Petty Officer, their intelligence specialist who could speak 3 local dialects fluently. They had inserted via helicopter during the early morning hours, rappelling into a valley approximately 2 kilometers from their target location. The initial approach went smoothly, with the team moving through the rugged terrain like ghosts, their movements coordinated through years of training and countless missions together. The weather was clear, and visibility was excellent as they established their observation post on a ridge overlooking the village. For nearly 18 hours, they watched and waited. The village appeared peaceful, with women tending to children and men working in small fields carved into the mountainside. There was no immediate sign of their target or any significant military presence. Maria positioned herself with a clear line of sight to the main compound where intelligence suggested their target was hiding. Her M24 sniper rifle was perfectly zeroed, and she had confirmed wind speed and direction multiple times. As the sun began to set on their second day, intercepted radio chatter indicating that their target was indeed present in the village. More concerning, however, was additional intelligence suggesting that a much larger Taliban force was converging on their location. What had been planned as a surgical extraction was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Jackson made the decision to move closer under cover of darkness. The team descended from their observation post and began infiltrating the village perimeter. Maria took up a new position approximately 800 meters from the target compound, with clear fields of fire covering multiple approach routes. The plan was for the assault team to breach the compound while she provided overwatch and eliminated any threats that emerged. Everything changed when the storm arrived. The weather front moved in with unexpected speed and fury. Within minutes, the clear mountain air was filled with driving rain and howling wind that reduced visibility to mere meters. The team's communications became intermittent as the storm interfered with their radio signals. What should have been a precisely coordinated operation suddenly became a deadly game of survival. The Taliban forces had been waiting for them. As the assault team approached the target compound, Maria detected movement through her scope. Despite the rain and wind, her trained eye caught the distinctive silhouettes of armed fighters positioning themselves around the village. There were far more than intelligence had indicated, perhaps 40 or 50 enemy combatants taking defensive positions in a coordinated pattern that suggested they had advance warning of the SEAL team's presence. Through her earpiece, she heard Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice cutting through the static. The team had reached the compound only to discover it was empty. Their target had already been moved, and they were walking into a carefully prepared ambush. The Taliban fighters were using the storm as cover, just as the SEAL team had attempted to do, but they had the advantage of numbers and familiar terrain. Maria's training took over as she began identifying targets through her scope. The advanced optics on her rifle allowed her to penetrate the rain and darkness better than the naked eye, revealing enemy positions that would have been invisible to others. She could see fighters armed with AK-47 rifles and rocket-propelled grenades moving to surround her teammates, who were now trapped in the village below. The first shots came from multiple directions simultaneously. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows, rooftops, and concealed positions throughout the village. The Taliban had turned the entire settlement into a killing field, with overlapping fields of fire that would make escape nearly impossible. Maria watched through her scope as her teammates took cover, returning fire as they tried to fight their way out of the trap. Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice crackled over the radio, barely audible through the storm interference. The team was pinned down in a small courtyard, taking fire from at least 3 different directions. They had wounded, and their ammunition was limited. Extraction was impossible under current conditions, and the storm was only getting worse. Maria began engaging targets with methodical precision. Despite the wind and rain, each shot found its mark. Her first target was a fighter on a rooftop who was directing fire toward her teammate's position. The .300 Winchester Magnum round traveled through the storm and struck the fighter's center mass, dropping him instantly. She immediately shifted to her next target, a group of 3 fighters advancing through an alley with RPGs. The storm was both enemy and ally. While it made shooting more difficult, it also concealed her muzzle flashes and made it nearly impossible for the enemy to locate her position. She used this to her advantage, moving between shooting positions and engaging targets from different angles to maintain the element of surprise. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every enemy fighter she eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. The Taliban had committed significant resources to this ambush, and they were prepared to sacrifice heavily to eliminate the SEAL team. Maria counted at least 30 active shooters, with more arriving as the battle intensified. Through her scope, she watched as Petty Officer Martinez was hit while trying to reach a wounded teammate. The medic went down hard, clutching his leg as blood began pooling beneath him. The team's situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional tactics were not going to save them. That was when Maria noticed something that would change everything. The Taliban fighters were using a series of connected buildings and covered walkways to move around the village while staying protected from her fire. The structures formed a rough semicircle around the courtyard where her teammates were trapped, with narrow choke points where the fighters had to expose themselves briefly as they moved between positions. More importantly, she realized that many of the buildings were old construction, built with traditional materials that included significant amounts of stored grain, cooking fuel, and other flammable materials. The fighters had unknowingly positioned themselves in what amounted to a powder keg, connected by wooden beams and thatch roofing that would burn rapidly once ignited. The storm continued to rage as Maria formulated a plan that would either save her teammates or get them all killed in the process. Maria's mind raced as she calculated angles, distances, and timing. The plan forming in her head was dangerous and required split-second precision under the worst possible conditions. She would have to hit specific targets in a precise sequence to create a chain reaction that would neutralize the overwhelming enemy force without harming her trapped teammates. The key was understanding the village layout and how the Taliban fighters were positioned. Through her scope, she could see that they had established 3 main firing positions in a semicircle around the courtyard. The first was a 2-story building to the north, where at least 12 fighters had positioned themselves with automatic weapons and grenades. The second position was a cluster of connected houses to the east, housing another 15 to 20 fighters. The third position was a grain storage facility to the south, where the remaining fighters had established what appeared to be their command post. Each position had been chosen for tactical advantage, but the fighters had made a critical error in their placement. The buildings they occupied were not only flammable, but also contained various materials that could become explosive under the right conditions. The grain storage facility, in particular, was filled with dried wheat and barley that could create a massive dust explosion if ignited properly. Maria's plan required hitting 3 specific targets in rapid succession. First, she would need to ignite the cooking fuel stored in the northern building. The flames would spread quickly through the wooden structure and force the fighters to evacuate their positions, exposing them to follow-up shots. Second, she would target a propane tank visible through a window in the eastern compound, creating an explosion that would collapse part of the building and eliminate fighters in that section. Finally, and most critically, she would need to hit a kerosene lamp hanging near grain sacks in the southern facility, creating the dust explosion that would devastate the command post. The timing had to be perfect. The shots needed to be fired in sequence with no more than 15 seconds between each one. Any longer, and the surviving fighters would realize what was happening and take countermeasures. Any shorter, and the explosions might interfere with each other, reducing their effectiveness. But there was another problem. The storm was intensifying, with wind gusts reaching 40 miles per hour and rain falling in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. The targets she needed to hit were small, precise points that would require adjusting for wind drift, bullet drop, and the movement of the targets themselves. Under normal conditions, these would be challenging shots for any sniper. In the current weather, they bordered on impossible. Maria closed her eyes and controlled her breathing, drawing on techniques learned through years of training and combat experience. She visualized each shot, calculating the precise adjustments needed for wind and distance. Her rifle was equipped with a high-power variable scope that could compensate for some of the visual obstacles created by the storm. But ultimately, success would depend on her ability to read the conditions and trust her instincts. Through her earpiece, she heard Lieutenant Commander Jackson attempting to coordinate his team's defensive fire. They were running low on ammunition and had 2 wounded members who needed immediate medical attention. The situation was becoming desperate, and extraction remained impossible as long as the Taliban maintained their positions around the village. Maria keyed her radio, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding her. "Overwatch to team leader. I have eyes on multiple targets. Prepare for immediate displacement on my mark. You will have a 15-second window to move to the rally point." Jackson's response was immediate. "Overwatch, we are in no position to move. Too much fire from multiple directions." "Trust me, sir. On my mark, move northeast toward the tree line. Do not look back, do not engage, just run." Maria settled into her firing position, adjusting her rifle's bipod legs to compensate for the uneven ground. The first target, a cooking fire visible through a window in the northern building, danced in her crosshairs as wind buffeted her position. She calculated wind speed and direction, adjusted for the bullet's trajectory over 800 meters, and began her breathing cycle. The shot had to be perfect. Missing would alert the enemy to her intention and likely result in the death of her entire team. She waited for a brief lull in the wind, feeling the moment when the storm's fury seemed to pause for just an instant. The rifle's report was swallowed by thunder as the .300 Winchester Magnum round streaked through the storm. Maria watched through her scope as the bullet struck a metal pot hanging over the cooking fire, spilling burning oil across wooden floor planks and stored grain sacks. Within seconds, flames began spreading up the walls and across the ceiling. She immediately shifted to her second target, the propane tank in the eastern compound. The Taliban fighters in the northern building were beginning to realize their position was compromised as smoke and flames forced them from their concealed positions. Several fighters emerged onto the building's roof, exposing themselves as they tried to escape the growing fire. The second shot required a more significant adjustment for wind drift. The propane tank was partially concealed behind a wooden shutter, presenting only a small target area. Maria compensated for the storm's effect on her bullet's trajectory and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was immediate and devastating. The propane tank detonated with enough force to collapse an entire section of the eastern compound, sending debris flying across the village and eliminating at least 8 fighters in the immediate vicinity. The blast's shockwave shattered windows throughout the area and added to the chaos as Taliban fighters tried to understand what was happening. Maria's final target was the most critical and dangerous. The kerosene lamp in the grain storage facility hung approximately 3 feet from a pile of wheat sacks that had been torn open, their contents spilling across the floor. If she could hit the lamp at precisely the right angle, the burning kerosene would ignite grain dust hanging in the air, creating an explosion that would devastate the entire southern position. The shot required threading the needle through a narrow window opening while accounting for the lamp's movement as it swayed in the storm. Maria tracked the target through her scope, waiting for the perfect moment when wind, distance, and timing aligned. As she prepared for the third shot, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. A small group of Taliban fighters had broken away from the main force and was moving up the mountainside toward her position. They had somehow identified her general location and were attempting to flank her while she was focused on providing support for her teammates. The approaching fighters numbered at least 6 men armed with assault rifles and grenades. They were approximately 400 meters away and moving quickly despite the difficult terrain and weather conditions. Maria had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be close enough to engage her effectively, forcing her to abandon her position before completing the mission. She made a split-second decision that would define the outcome of the entire operation. Instead of taking the careful, methodical approach she had planned, Maria would fire all remaining shots in rapid succession, trusting her training and instincts to compensate for the abbreviated preparation time. The third shot left her rifle as lightning illuminated the mountainside. Through her scope, she watched the bullet strike the kerosene lamp, shattering the glass and sending burning fuel cascading onto the grain-covered floor below. For a moment, nothing happened, and Maria feared the shot had failed to achieve its intended effect. Then the grain storage facility erupted in a massive fireball that lit up the entire valley. The dust explosion was even more powerful than Maria had anticipated, completely destroying the southern compound and eliminating the Taliban command post in a single devastating blast. The explosion's roar echoed off the surrounding mountains, audible even above the storm's fury. In the space of 90 seconds, Maria had eliminated 42 enemy fighters and broken the ambush that had trapped her teammates. The surviving Taliban forces, fewer than a dozen men, were scattered and disorganized, their command structure destroyed, and their defensive positions compromised. Through her earpiece, she heard Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice, filled with amazement and relief. "Overwatch, what the hell was that?" "Fireworks, sir. Rally point is clear. Move now." But Maria's immediate danger was far from over. The flanking force was still approaching her position, and she would need to deal with them before she could rejoin her team. Maria quickly assessed her tactical situation as the flanking Taliban force continued their advance up the mountainside. The explosions in the village below had illuminated her general position, and the approaching fighters were moving with the confidence of men who believed they had cornered their prey. They were wrong, but that confidence could make them more dangerous. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the enemy reached effective firing range. Her current position, while excellent for long-range shooting into the village, offered limited cover and no escape route that wouldn't expose her to fire from below. The rocky outcropping where she had established her hide was essentially a dead end, with steep cliffs on 3 sides and the approaching Taliban fighters blocking the only viable exit. Maria made a tactical decision that went against every instinct screaming in her head. Instead of attempting to retreat or take a defensive position, she would advance directly toward the enemy force. The maneuver was counterintuitive and dangerous, but it had the advantage of being completely unexpected. The Taliban fighters were expecting her to run or hide, not charge directly at them through a thunderstorm. She quickly broke down her sniper rifle, separating the barrel from the stock to create a more compact weapon system. While this eliminated her long-range precision capability, it made the weapon much more maneuverable in close-quarters combat. She also drew her sidearm, a SIG P226 pistol loaded with hollow-point ammunition designed for maximum stopping power. The storm continued to rage as Maria began her descent down the mountainside, using the terrain and weather to mask her movement. Lightning flashes provided brief moments of visibility while simultaneously destroying the night vision adaptation of anyone looking in her direction. She moved like a ghost through the rocky terrain, each step calculated to minimize noise and avoid detection. The first Taliban fighter never saw her coming. Maria approached from an angle that placed a large boulder between herself and the rest of the enemy force. The fighter was focused on scanning the area where her muzzle flashes had originated, completely unaware that she had moved from that position. Maria closed to within 10 meters before he noticed her presence, and by then it was too late. A single suppressed shot from her pistol dropped him silently. The second and third fighters were moving together, approximately 30 meters ahead of their dead comrade. They had spread out to cover more ground, but their formation was loose and undisciplined. Maria used the storm noise to mask her approach, moving when thunder rolled across the mountains and freezing in place during the brief, quiet moments between gusts. She reached a position where she could engage both fighters simultaneously. The challenge was eliminating them quickly enough to prevent either from alerting the remaining force to her presence. Maria chose her targets carefully, waiting for a moment when both fighters were looking away from each other and from her position. The engagement lasted less than 3 seconds. Maria's first shot struck the leftmost fighter center mass, dropping him instantly. She immediately pivoted and engaged the second target, who was beginning to turn toward the sound of the first shot. Her second bullet found its mark before the fighter could bring his weapon to bear or call out a warning. 3 down, 3 to go. But the remaining fighters were more alert now, having heard something that didn't sound quite right even over the storm's noise. They had stopped their advance and were scanning the area more carefully, their weapons ready and fingers on triggers. Maria realized she would need to change tactics again. The remaining fighters were too spread out and too alert for her to approach undetected. Instead, she would use the environment to her advantage, creating a situation where the enemy would be forced to expose themselves while she maintained cover and concealment. She identified a natural choke point approximately 50 meters ahead where the fighters would be forced to traverse a narrow ledge between two large rock formations. The ledge was barely wide enough for one person and offered no cover from above. If she could position herself correctly, she would have a clear shot at each fighter as they crossed the danger area. Maria climbed rapidly up the rocky slope, her movements sure and confident despite the treacherous conditions. Years of mountain warfare training had prepared her for exactly this type of terrain and weather. She reached her chosen position just as the first of the remaining fighters approached the ledge. The fighter was cautious, clearly aware that the area presented a tactical vulnerability. He moved slowly across the ledge, weapon at the ready and eyes scanning constantly. But he was looking for threats at his own level, not from above where Maria had positioned herself among the rocks. Her shot was perfectly placed, striking the fighter as he reached the midpoint of the ledge where retreat or advance would be equally difficult. He fell immediately, his body tumbling down the mountainside and alerting the remaining two fighters to Maria's elevated position. The fourth and fifth fighters responded exactly as Maria had anticipated. Instead of retreating or seeking cover, they attempted to climb up to her position, believing they could overwhelm her through superior numbers and aggressive tactics. It was a decision that demonstrated courage but lacked tactical wisdom. Maria allowed them to begin their climb before engaging. She waited until both fighters were committed to the ascent, at a point where they could neither retreat quickly nor find adequate cover. Then she systematically eliminated them with precise pistol fire, each shot placed with the same accuracy that had made her legendary with a sniper rifle. The mountainside fell silent except for the continuing storm. Maria had eliminated 6 enemy fighters in close-quarters combat while armed only with a pistol and broken-down rifle. It was a display of tactical skill and combat effectiveness that would have been remarkable under ideal conditions, let alone during a thunderstorm on treacherous mountain terrain. She quickly reassembled her rifle and began moving toward the village rally point where her teammates should be waiting. The explosions had died down, and she could see through her scope that the remaining Taliban fighters had either fled or been eliminated. The ambush had been completely broken, and the immediate threat to her team was over. As she approached the rally point, Maria's radio crackled to life. Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice was clear and strong, indicating that he and the team had successfully escaped the village and were preparing for extraction. Overwatch, what's your status? All clear, sir. Heading to rally point now. We're going to need immediate medical evacuation for the wounded. Copy that. Extraction birds are already inbound. Estimated time 15 minutes. Maria felt the adrenaline beginning to fade as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. In the space of less than 10 minutes, she had eliminated 48 enemy fighters and broken an ambush that could have resulted in the death or capture of her entire team. It was the kind of combat action that would be studied in military schools for decades to come. But as she reached the rally point and saw the wounded members of her team, Maria's focus shifted immediately to their care and the successful completion of the mission. The precision shots and tactical maneuvering were just tools in service of a larger goal, bringing her teammates home alive. The helicopter extraction went smoothly, with the wounded team members receiving immediate medical attention during the flight back to base. The storm began to clear as they flew south, revealing the destruction in the village below. The 3 explosions had completely altered the landscape, leaving crater-like depressions where the Taliban positions had been. In her after-action report, Maria would describe the engagement in clinical, professional terms that barely hinted at the extraordinary skill and courage required to achieve such results. The official record would note 48 enemy casualties with 0 friendly losses, making it one of the most successful small-unit actions in the war's history. But for Maria, the true measure of success was much simpler. When the mission seemed impossible and her teammates were facing certain death, She had found a way to tip the odds in their favor. The precision shots in the storm had not just eliminated enemy fighters, they had brought her brothers-in-arms home safely. Years later, when asked about that night in the Hindu Kush Mountains, Maria would simply say that she had done her job. It was the kind of modest response typical of